So building on our conversations we've been having around well-being with guests like Richard Safir and Carrie Cullen and Jeff McDonald and Neil Greenberg and others, what's been building up for me and clarifying for me is a picture that leaders really need to recast their thinking about well-being. And we've talked about this before, but it's just so important. Not well-being as a cost they need to offset, but a core part of what an organization should actually be about.
Yeah, I agree. I think it comes down to this deal that we have, the value exchange. In the past, the old deal was, you did a good job, we'll reward you well, you get security, we get loyalty and so on. And that's clearly not working. But organizations still rely tacitly on that value exchange. And it's just not the story that's there in people's minds.
Mm-hmm. So for you, what do you think the new deal looks like?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think what these guests are all trying to figure out in their own way is what that looks like. Because work now demands more from us than it did in the past. More time, more energy, more commitment, more of ourselves. So what we need is a new set of value exchanges. So pull that apart, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Well, I think so, yeah. I think organizations need to recognize that if they don't move past the kind of transactional approach to well-being, to giving people things to support well-being and then taking them away when times get tough, like their benefits, that's the big message they're sending them out. This is a kind of benefit in kind. They're going to suffer more quitting, more low engagement, more stressed out teams, because the demands are just getting more intense. So it really, we need a new way of thinking about this.
Yeah, and I've said this before, and well, we both have, but instead, what leaders need to do is see that meeting their people's needs is essential to performing sustainably. It needs to become a source of competitive advantage, not seen as a cost.
Yeah, because work's now so all-encompassing in our lives. We can't just rely on home and social life to take care of renewal, for example, because we're working there too. I mean, how many people do you see checking their email on the beach, by the pool? It's everyone. They might be pretending that they're not, but they're all doing it.
So in this show, we're talking to the researcher, Rob Cross, who we've spoken with before on the topic of collaboration overload, and that was a great episode. And here we're talking about his new research on the cumulative effects of microstress.
Yeah, and what he's drawing our attention to is the fine detail of what influences our well-being, things that we might otherwise lose sight of in the noise of the bigger pieces of this puzzle.
Everything and anything we can bring to help our listeners solve the well-being crisis is valuable to us. So let's get going.
Let's do it.
Hi friends, welcome to the Evolving Leader Podcast, the show born from the belief that we need deeper, more accountable, and more human leadership to confront the world's biggest challenges. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, Mr. Gomes?
I am feeling pretty good. I had a lovely weekend. It was my wife's birthday, so I'm feeling buoyed up from that experience. And I am feeling very excited about reconnecting with our guest today because, we have talked before. How are you feeling, Scott?
I'm feeling a real mix of things today. Had a lovely excursion with my family for part of the kids' fall break, so we had a nice little getaway. But I'm feeling pretty heavy and sad about a lot of the state of the world and what's happening all around us. Today we're joined once again by an Evolving Leader favorite, Mr. Rob Cross. Rob is a Senior Vice President of Research for I4CP and the Edward A. Madden Professor of Global Leadership at Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Rob joined us on Season 4 of The Evolving Leader to talk to us about his book, Beyond Collaboration Overload, which we got a lot of positive feedback from our listeners. And since then, he's written a new book this year called Microstress, which again has received much critical acclaim, striking a resonant chord with people everywhere. Rob, it's great to have you back. welcome to The Evolving Leader.
All right. Thank you so much.
Rob, welcome back. How have you been since we last talked last spring, and how are you feeling today?
Doing well overall, and as the listeners may hear, I have a slight cold because this weekend was a pretty busy one. Actually has a lot of relevance to what we're going to talk about. I had a grad school classmate pass away very suddenly, and it turned into this catalytic moment for probably 40 of us that all came back together. I ended up having a lot of house guests and a bunch of people over at my house. So the past 3 days have been a blur of reconnecting with people that I haven't had a lot of time with for the past 25 years, but was super close to early in my life. So very positive, but very little sleep. And so I think somehow it led into a cold. But as we go, the listeners will hopefully get a sense of why that matters a little bit later on in the show here.
Well, we're sorry for your loss, Rob. So let's remind our listeners a bit more about you. Imagine we're at a dinner party and I'm in a completely unrelated field. I do construction or something of that nature. How would you introduce yourself and your work to someone who has none of the reference points that we normally assume people might have on a show like ours?
So I'm talking to my mom, you're saying?
Yeah, your mom. Your mom's asking you, what is it you do?
Exactly. I don't know, Mom. So we have over the years developed an analytic way of looking at collaboration and relationships, right? And understanding kind of who's interacting with whom and what they're actually receiving from each other, the quality of the exchanges in different ways. And so for the most recent two books, the one we spoke about before and the one we'll speak about today, what I was really doing was looking at what's the effect of the connections in our lives, both professional and personal. First, very heavily focused on performance, and that was the book we talked about last time. And then this was a book that really came about as a product of the consortia pushing me to say, well, what we care about is not just performance, but people that are sustainable and really thriving in their lives. And so this one really came down on the focus of what's the role of relationships in our well-being or happiness today. And it's really crazy when you start digging into this. I started really doing it at 600 interviews, right? In-depth interviews with people on this and the way in which the people in both our professional and our personal lives affect our well-being. But then I also started researching the other bodies of work out there. And it is really amazing to me, if you fall into this category of being clinically lonely, as an example, which means you just don't have people to talk to about important things, in your life. Turns out about a third of the population is in that space. The mortality rate is the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, greater likelihood of 26% greater likelihood of dying early. Depression, dementia, all these risk factors shoot up. And what's stunning to me is we don't pay attention to it. We don't think intentionally about how are we building and cultivating these connections. We just let it happen, in more serendipitous ways. Whereas, we'll chase blood pressure medicines down to the ends of the earth or cholesterol medications or things like that and ignore, something that has this same effect. So that's really what I think we'll focus mainly on today is that body of work. And the idea got titled The Microstress Effect because the publishers always want a term that'll go viral if they're lucky. But the real focus was on how do the connections in our lives today affect both positively and negatively our sense of kind of happiness and well-being.
Can we come back to a statistic you said? Did you say that loneliness has just as much detrimental effect towards mortality as cigarettes?
As smoking 15 cigarettes a day, the rate of mortality, the mortality rate is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day if you fall into this category of being clinically lonely. And, what's fascinating about it is my work shows that being overwhelmed, obviously with collaboration, is a problem. And in some senses, because it's taking us away from the quality of connections, that we need in our lives and in different ways. And it actually turns out that our most connected generation, right, the Gen Z, group, they're connected in a way that nobody ever has been before, but they actually are the loneliest generation too. It's actually not the elderly populations and things out there. So it in many ways boils down to the quality of the connections we have in our lives, both professionally and personally. And those have definitely drifted, not just through the pandemic, but what we see is this started happening about 12 years ago. and affecting people's lives. The pandemic just kind of accelerated it very quickly because of social distancing and the degree to which that pulled us out of groups that were kind of keeping us whole in different ways.
That's it's frightening in terms of the problem that's storing up for future generations. Can you give us a sense of the reasons behind that disconnection that generation's experiencing?
Yeah, one is just the sheer frenzy, that we're in right now, and mostly what I studied. So I'm gonna, admittedly be the boy with a hammer because I'm looking at the relationships and collaborations that are happening. What I'm seeing is it's less the amount of work that's shooting up, and it's more the collaborative footprint around the work that has started to consume people's times in ways that's invisible based on the conventional metrics we tend to look at. And so just, one simple example that most people resonate with is pre-pandemic, people would complain about, having meetings all the time. And what they meant by that, say meetings all day long and I can't get anything done until I go home. And what they usually meant by that is they had 8 1-hour meetings, in their day. And then somebody through the pandemic came up with the idea that let's go to 30 or 25-minute meetings. And what has evolved now is we have 16 30-minute meetings for a lot of places, right? And it's a real frenzy, right? You're more intense in those meetings. You're switching across them more rapidly. You end the day with to-do list based on 16, not 8 meetings. And that, ratchets up the work, right? We're working 5 to 8 hours more a week, earlier into the morning, deeper into the night. And it's created less space for people to connect as humans. And what I can see with my happier people, I know we want to talk about the microstress ideas, but the second half of the book was really on the happiest people in our research. And what we could see is they tended to almost universally have authentic connections with at least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of their profession, right? And it was the dimensionality that those groups created that enabled them to see the stress differently, right? And to not get absorbed in the minutia quite as much. And so when I'm referencing this funeral that I had this weekend, I was less focused on the funeral and more on the degree to which it was a catalytic event that brought relationships, very deep relationships back into to life in a pretty cool way that I think we all have a lot more latitude to do that when we think, to reach back to connections from the past and slingshot forward.
So we'll come back to relationships in a moment, but I'd love to start with the book and because it has gotten a lot of interest. So let's start with the difference between stress and microstress.
Yeah. So stress for us, we tend to think of it as the big events that, they invoke the fight or flight response. They get the cortisol jolt, kind of evolutionary wise, what we're conditioned to do and move into kind of fight or flight, mode. It's things that our bodies kind of recognize. For us, that was not what we were hearing was killing people. You do 600 interviews and you're focused very specifically, not just on the positive aspects of connections, but ways that relationships and collaborations create stress or create anxiety or other things like that. And it wasn't the big things in general. There may be health scares. There may be problems with your child or your parents or whatever. But what was drowning people were these small moments, and so this might take the form of you are on a call and you sense misalignment with a colleague, and you're wondering, how am I going to solve that? And that goes into the back of your brain. It's not fight or flight. You're not panicked about it, but you're like, where am I going to get the time? This is important before the train gets down the tracks too far. And maybe in the next call, you see a teammate that needs to be coached for the 3rd time. And you're kind of back of your mind again. How am I going to do that and keep their engagement along with a misaligned colleague? And maybe 10 minutes later, you get a text from a child, right? And you can't tell if they're just grumbling about something or if it's a big deal. And usually they're done with it in 2 minutes. You worry about it for 3 hours, right? Not fight or flight, but in the back of your mind. And the problem is we're getting hit with 20, 25, 30 of these a day, if not more. And our minds don't really register it, right? In fact, most people are successful. They just say, oh, this is something to get over, right? It's just another thing, right, that you kind of work through. But our bodies are registering it. Our bodies actually absorb this in the same way as kind of the big stress. And so it hits us from a blood pressure standpoint, a heart rate standpoint. Most of us have this feeling, we hit the end of the day, our heads hit the pillow, and we're exhausted, but we can't quite say what just happened. We can't quite put a finger on what did it. And a lot of it is this kind of accumulation of these small moments coming to us, not just from people we don't like or frustrated with. These things actually come at us more impactfully from people we love. right? Our children, our parents, our siblings, whatever it may be, that have a draining impact on us. One of the studies we found were actually showing metabolically even that if the person at Northeastern set up this controlled experiment, gave people the same caloric meal, right, same calories meal, but in one instance they were under this form of social stress that I'm describing, right, these constant barrages within 2 hours of eating the meal, and the other they weren't. The people that were under the stress, their bodies added 104 calories to that meal, right, just in terms of how they processed it. So it doesn't sound like a big deal, but you extrapolate that out, and in her study it was 11 pounds a year. That's just a product of, the stress. So it has even though our minds don't kind of hit in that fight or flight response, it's the accumulation, right, that we allow to happen around us because we just think, oh, you just get through this, right? That is having the big effect.
Yeah, I told Scott I was adhering to my diet. Now this explains it.
Yeah, what's happening? Yeah, it's not the Twinkies.
No.
Yeah.
So beyond the this is so interesting because beyond the 100 calories, why is it so important that we become more aware of microstressors? Because I could imagine somebody listening saying, "I'm resilient, I'm tough. If it's not triggering my fight or flight response, I'm not going to worry about it. It's just life. Deal with it." You could be really easily dismissive of it, but it's important. So to pull out why it's so important that we become aware of it.
For me, it's a handful of things. So one is you go through 600 interviews in something like this, and you're 90 minutes in, and everybody has that first reaction, right? In the top end of these interviews, everybody, the first 10 minutes, life is rainbows and lollipops. Like my kids are in the right place and here and here. And then you start digging in to kind of how they feel like they're doing professionally, and then how they're showing up as a parent, a provider, all the stresses that society puts on us, at that level too. And, you get into minute 30, minute 45, the cracks come in, minute 75, many people actually, some were choking up by the end of it, just with the amount that's kind of hitting them, and they hadn't thought about the web that they were in. And what I always really didn't like with those people were describing stories of kind of 5-8 years that they were just chugging along, just getting through life, and it just happened as a product, not of a big thing that went wrong, but this slow accumulation of the small that they get trapped in. What I can see, what's interesting to me, let me say it this way, is that my 10 percenters, the people there were about 90% of the population I studied that went that trajectory. They started positive, life is rainbows and lollipops, and then went negative. About 10% never did it. They would just stay positive. So they were crushing performance, and yet they were living in ways that dealt with these microstressors differently. They engaged with others in ways that created energy and purpose. And the stories were entirely different. The stories I hated hearing were highly successful people who made bazillions of dollars, but they'd also, had no relationship with their children, 3 divorces, and irreparable health right at that point. And so it got to be a pretty big deal for me. For your listeners, one quick stat is we know that a negative interaction in our lives has 3 to 5 times the impact of a positive, right? And so if what we're doing to kind of be happier or maintain our well-being is just meditation, mindfulness, yoga, all those things are really important, but they're just helping you persist, basically, in the system that you've allowed to kind of create around you in different ways. And so what we know is that if you adapt the negative, right, and actually shift that is the higher leverage stuff than reaching for a positive, right? It actually has a bigger impact on you. And it can come in really subtle forms. My daughter was a high-level tennis player, and I chased her around the country, trying to support her in different ways in her sport and what she was doing. And what we had fallen into, because it was always just us at these tournaments, is just this pattern of whenever anything went wrong, she'd be Baldy, this is going on, Baldy this, Baldy that. For those of you guys that can't see, I'm hair challenged here, and her nickname for me is Baldy, and it made sense in those contexts, right? Because I was the one there supporting her. But she's going into med school, and I'm still getting these texts now, Baldy this, Baldy that. And one night over a glass of wine up in Cambridge, we're laughing about it, about how her stress cascades to me. And she said, Dad, I don't even think about that stuff when I send it. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. And I'm like, well, Squirt, I worry about it for 3 or 4 hours. And so if it doesn't matter to you, don't send it to me. And when it does matter, send it, right? And I'll be on it immediately. But that, as silly as that sounds, that focus not on the relationship, but on what are the interactions in the relationship that are causing problems and adapting that. It's had an impactful, impact on my life, right? And just not getting hit with that and worrying about it. And it's actually solidified the relationship even more, right? I'm not getting these things going, oh my gosh, another thing. When I do get them, I know it's important and we're on it like that. You know what I mean? And so I think a tendency a lot of times with the stressors is too often people start to distance from the relationship rather than saying, what's the interaction that I address in here? I think that's a problem with a lot of the counseling stuff today, is they say, put up boundaries. And that's great. It may block some things, but we actually desperately need these connections too in our lives. And a lot of the blank put up boundaries is starting to shift people away from that if we're not careful in it.
I guess when we're overwhelmed, it's easy to try and find symptomatic solutions because they don't ask very much of us. And what you're talking about here is something that gets to a first principle about what's happening in a relationship and trying to affect it at that level. Is that kind of what you're seeing with this 10% about how they're managing to cope with microstress differently from everything else, or is there something else going on?
I think they're more intentional about it and just more thought. I mean, if you think about it, the reality is we all holistically have more ability to shape what we do and who we do it with than any generation in the past. And yet we fall into everybody else's expectations, and what I would find is at the heart of it, my 10%ers, they were just a little bit more intentional and being clear on kind of, what and how work played a role in their lives, what other things were critical. And they architected that in, and then they were very clear on shifting the negative patterns, in their lives versus letting them persist. We've been doing, in the book, we talk about the 14 microstressors, and we have people go through a table that says, what are 2 or 3 that you're experiencing that are systemic enough that you should do something about? What are 2 or 3 that you're causing others? Because what we know is the stress we unnecessarily create inevitably boomerangs back on us in a different form, right? We push a child too hard or whatever, and that shows up in the form of belligerence, or an employee too hard and they start to disengage and we're absorbing more work. And then what are 2 or 3 that you should rise above? So we can be very tactical, right, in using something like that to say, okay, it's actually not a sea of stress we're in. And we actually can get down and do some very targeted things that, again, because of that leverage, 3 to 5 times the impact of adding a positive, it has a quantifiable impact. What I learned in this, as not just from the book, but as we've been doing a bunch of action, learning experiments, is for many, many, many people, it is easier to just absorb the stress than to deal with it in the moment. Right? Psychically, it's just easier to just say, okay, I'm going to take it. But it layers on just like weight, right? It doesn't go away, right? These things keep coming back in different patterns. I find if I can get people, we have these 6-week sprints that we've been doing as experiments, and I won't bore you with the specifics of it, but week 1, everybody's terrified, right? I can't do this thing. And then they go do it and the world doesn't tilt on its axis and everything's great. They show up week 2, they're still like, I can't do this thing, But what's interesting is by week 4, many of them have changed and they're saying, here's the impact of being more proactive on it. They're seeing it. They're more willing to kind of just shape the interactions around them. And so that's kind of my hope from this, is that people start to leverage the ideas that way and see that we can, in fact, be a lot more intentional than sometimes we give ourselves latitude for.
You've provided an amazing resource in the in the Microstress app, which anybody can go on download, and it's really great in terms of providing an analysis of what your microstresses might be and strategies for. You give away an awful lot in this. What are you using that for at your end? Are you collating that stuff to aid your research?
Yep, we definitely are doing that. So if you go into it, which you will know, you filled out some things that help us start to see, do men and women struggle with this differently? Populations of minority populations, right, or people that are higher in the hierarchy. So we've just actually finished a piece looking at that. We've had a tremendous number of people, come through and use the app that way. And you find, for example, that women across 13 of the 14 microstresses, they absorb them or experience them at a greater rate than men out there. We find conventional markers of success, like height in the hierarchy, education level. All of those are associated with greater experience of microstress out there. So conventional markers of success actually, make you or put you in a position to where many people are more susceptible to this professionally and personally. But that app for your listeners, that's what you could do this with your team, right? What I was just describing, what we have people do is go out to the app, pull down one microstress they're going to work on during a week. They commit to it to the group, right? And then on the Monday morning and then on Friday, they write to the group, here's what I did. Right. And that's what I meant about people that were panicking Monday morning. I don't know if I can do this big, hairy thing. And then finding out they actually did it Friday and nothing shifted. But you just organize your group and kind of work through something like that over 6 weeks, or maybe make it 12 and do every other week. It's really amazing how people's, not just that they're seeing this stuff, but that their posture to it is shifting. They start to see, I can control this more than I thought I could in the moment, which to me is a really big deal, and why we do give away as much as we do with the app, just to kind of get it into people's hands and used.
That's really interesting about the difference between men and women. Did you find any causation, correlation? What's the root cause of the differences? I think
this is where I got to be careful, right? As the middle-aged, balding male in what I say. So I think it's driven in part. We can see from my book around collaboration overload that all the statistics through that is women have a greater tendency to get in trouble around collaboration overload from a desire to help. They're driven differently. And I mean that statistically. We see it over and over and over again, as there is whether that's societally bred, what I mean, based on role expectations, or it's something innate. I think there is things that are driven that way. And then I think there are things that are driven externally, that in general, an easy example is women absorb, especially if they're in careers, they're absorbing typically more of the childcare, roles than men, for whatever reason. I don't think it's certainly something that people should be looking at and saying men are bad and women are good. I think it's just expectations, right? That kind of people put on each other, in how they're managing things. So I think it's a combination, of things like that. What I do find, though, also interesting is women are much better at building these kinds of networks that persist and actually help them cope with the stress differently. Men tend to isolate everything into, one or maybe two people. Women have a richer set of connections in their lives that help them process things, get a sense of purpose, resilience, that way. And so there's, again, not good or bad. They're just kind of strengths and weaknesses to either approach.
So how are you seeing, you mentioned a few moments ago, the implication around engagement with prolonged exposure to microstresses. What else are you seeing? How are you seeing this issue play out in the workplace?
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the biggest drivers of burnout, personally. Now, again, and we're, we can see it statistically, and this is, again, where I'm the boy with a hammer, and I'm saying we're looking at the effect of all these interactions we're in, right? That's my lens into the world, is to try and make that visible and bring it up. A lot of people, when they do that table in the book that I just mentioned about what are you experiencing, what are you causing, what do you need to rise above, we don't have a column for yourself in there, right? Even though we know that for many people we're our own worst enemy, right? In terms of putting stress on ourselves. So my lens is very much, focused on the relationships, just because it hasn't been really thought of as much as sheer volume of work or other things like that. But what we can certainly see is it's driving burnout, it's driving attrition in different ways. It used to be that just not getting connected enough in these networks was the biggest predictor of voluntary departure. Now we're finding it's bimodal, right? It's the people that can't break in, it's the people that are overwhelmed in different ways that choose to kind of back out. And I believe, and part of the reason I'm running these experiments that I mentioned about how do you not just communicate these ideas, but get them to be a habit for people, to be looking for them, to be shaping their lives. I believe if we're right on this, that, culturally you can identify how and where is stress propagated, right, using my broader tools, and then be more precise, right, on what people do about it. And if we're right, I really think we'd see fewer people going into clinical categories of care. And that could be enormously impactful, right, on a moral front as well as an economic front, in different ways. We had last year in the United States, I won't get the statistic right in here, but it was something like a 25% increase in college students seeking counseling for the first time. So 25% in 1 year. And I guarantee you, as a professor, the workload has not gone up through COVID. It's gone down, right? It's the relational things we're talking about. People, the kids especially, experiencing stress from social media and social comparison, the lack of quality connections at that age. And so it has, significant costs in different ways that we're seeing.
In collaboration overload, I think what you did there was you pointed out something that was very true about how people's lives have fundamentally changed, and particularly the highest performers that become the organization becomes dependent upon to drive collaboration across the organization. And I think you've done the same thing here again, which is you've nailed something that is probably implicit, but we're not really aware of. You're shining a light on something that is kind of invisible to many, many people. As you think about what you're doing here, how is that going to change the way in which we think about how organizations need to look after people differently, or trying to align their capabilities with the demands facing them? How do you see this playing out in a bigger picture?
I mean, my hope is if we can continue to build the momentum. You do a book like Microstress Effect, and you're doing hundreds of interviews, right, to understand the issue. And those interviews, are a great strategy, very time consuming, right, to get something like that done. But it's what lets you get to that experience that you're describing, where people go, oh my gosh, I got this going on, right, in my life. It is, what's happening. And my hope is that we're able to develop the right approaches to inject this into organizations. I believe it's in the teams, right? I don't think this is a well-being initiative. You know what I mean? Or I don't think it's something like that just becomes put on a website and people do it or don't. I think if we're really lucky, I'll be able to get the right examples over the next 5 years and say, look, these companies that take this seriously, their rates of innovation, their rates of performance are significantly higher. Maybe we're able to show how an impact of raising the bottom quartile of team performance to mid quartile as a product of people feeling whole and healthy and engaged in work. I mean, when we look at this, it's not that this is not like a kumbaya moment, right? It's saying these teams need to execute on the things they have to get done, but simultaneously they need to be fueling people, right, today, more so than in the past. And we can already see in some of the analytics we've run that the performance delta was huge. The groups that do both those things well, right, in terms of revenue production, one of the major consulting firms, was huge. So what I would like to see is that we're able to produce those cases, right, revenue, innovation rates, keeping people out of clinical categories of care, attrition reduction, things like that, that gets people's attention. And then I think what it really is, and the way we're designing these interventions, is it's not just that you deliver the content. That app is very cool with the videos and the cards that spin and everything else, but it really needs to spur a set of conversations. So the architecture of these things are, in many cases we're seeing somebody gets a nudge on the microstress and then their leader gets that nudge too. And it starts a conversation there. And then there's a tool that goes into the team, and then these people laterally are talking. And I think that's what's going to create more, enduring change if we're lucky over the course of the next couple of years. Now, what'll keep it from happening is everybody just say, I'm too busy, right? I don't have time for this, and kind of continue to spin in different ways. But that's my hope, is that it just becomes kind of part of how people are working and thinking about, not just execution, but the quality of the experience in the teams themselves.
I love the term that you and your co-author use, secondhand stress. Maybe because I grew up in secondhand smoke. I don't know. I just like the term, but it really resonated with me, and I'd love for you to unpack what is secondhand stress.
Yeah. So it is, because of how interconnected we are, we oftentimes experience a stress, but then it traffics, into other points, right, in our networks or lives. And so just some simple examples. One of the micro stresses is sudden and unexpected shifts in expectations, right? Leaders that are constantly changing. Typically it takes the form of the what of the work, the performance expectations or timeline, or just emotionally. They show up differently from point A to point B, and you can't get it. Everybody's had that experience, and they're like, yeah, that stinks, right? But what they forget is it starts to cascade another layer of things, right? Where you've got to go protect your team, get them re-engaged in a different direction. Or maybe on the first direction, you've gone out and solidified help with 4 or 5 other colleagues. And then with this shift, you don't need their help, but you're stuck delivering for them, and you got to go find new colleagues, to help in the new direction. So those are all secondary stresses, right? Or another real common one is people will have some experience slight at work, right? And they go home and they complain to their significant other. Now, the significant other knows no other side of the story than your own. So all they do is say, oh my gosh, you've been wronged. We should do something about it. Then they further stress somebody out, right? Because they're replaying it, not with an eye to, gosh, here's what you could have done, or here's maybe the perspective in the situation. It's just empathy purely that kind of spins it up. Or even the story I was just describing with Rachel, right? She would experience stress, and her valve, my daughter, Rachel, her valve was just to send it to me, right? And there was a hugely asymmetric effect of that, right? Without really, reflecting on it. So those are a couple of examples, and I could go on with more, and I'm sure everybody on this show has had scenarios where one email cascades into, a massive tsunami of things that people are trying to understand, or other elements like that. That's probably the biggest example we use in the book, is cascading that way.
I'm thinking through, you've been talking about loneliness and the need for connection, and the idea that boundaries can get overplayed at the sacrifice of deep, meaningful connection. We're also talking now about secondhand stress, which is, if we're not careful, we can go to the most important relationships in our lives and cause stress and perpetuate stress for both parties, because they, like you said, they only have one side of the story. So you gave a great story about you and your daughter, of how you worked through that. But I'm thinking about, couples at home that come home at the end of a long day, and they're bringing their stresses home. I'm thinking about friendships. How do people do this all really well? How do people connect on a deeply personal level and avoid the pitfalls of secondhand stress?
So I think, to me, every one of these is different, right? And that's the architecture of the book. Like, it's a different thing if what's driving me crazy is conflictual conversations, right, versus shifts in identity. You know what I mean? Those are very different things. So each of these, they feel like small moments. And by shifts in identity, for your listeners, what we find a lot of times is when people leave one job and go to work for another, they get promoted in different ways. We forget the degree to which the interactions we have in our lives, once they're taken away, formed a piece of our identity, right? The degree to which we were a musician, or a spiritual person, or a health conscious person, whatever it was, as we get pulled out of those groups, kind of dissipates in different ways. So those are very different things, right? To think about, how do I, kind of absolve that. I think for me, if I kind of broadly say, what I think matters, Scott, to your question, is the happier people in my work, they tended to maintain dimensionality in their lives. And so they tended to have at least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of their profession and direct family that kept them anchored and as broader people. And they just saw the world differently when they did that well. They didn't get down into the minutia. The stories that I heard that ended poorly were people where it just became purely about their role as provider, and that never stopped, right? It was always a moving target about this next home we need in the next community, children in the next school. It was never like materialism in the sense that I need a Italian watch or whatever. I don't know if there are Italian watches, but whatever it is, like, they don't need the thing, but it was that role of provider that was very materialism driven, right? Social comparison driven. Those were not good stories. In contrast, the ones I heard where people maintained dimensionality in their lives, they just tend to keep things in a very different perspective. And I think that translates into home and relationships, the degree to which you kind of come in. And so I'll give you one example from the book. It was a very successful Silicon Valley executive. She ran the venture fund and the strategy office for the very well-known software organization. And I was interviewing her, and she had been a runner all her life. I think she came out of Stanford. She's probably mid-40s when I was speaking with her. And when I sat down to talk to her, she said, Rob, because I would focus on, tell me about times that connections in your life had a positive effect on physical health, growth, purpose, and resilience. And she said, Rob, I let society tell me what running was good for the first 20 years, coming out of college. It was a huge mistake. And I kind of got super intrigued by that, right? And what she meant by that is that she would, if she didn't get a personal best time every year, right, for her, the runs that she was doing, if it wasn't a personal best time, it became a bad year for running, right? And we know that's not sustainable, right? You get older physically, the demands of the profession take off, the demands of personal life take off with children and everything else. But she was living her life against that. Right? She was getting up earlier in the morning to stretch more, to do yoga, to do weight training, all with this idea that I'm not going to go lightly, right? I'm going to get that, personal best time. And what she realized is that all that time, cumulatively, it snuck up on her, but all that time was taking her away from time with family, time with, friends that she wanted to cultivate, extended family, things like that. And so she pivoted and said, what I really want to be doing is running with, my daughter, her best friend, and a parent. And they started running, and it evolved into this group of parents and children that would run together. And she said, I've never been happier, right? And the principle behind that, in the book, there's a chapter that talks about kind of these sources of purpose in our life, not as a product of the work, but as a product of the relationships that we have around us professionally and personally. The principle behind that, and what I saw with the happier people, is, what she did was take an activity she was already doing, which was running, right, and not pursue it in isolation or, by other people's standards, but pursue it with a slight pivot in a way that pulled her into two groups where the authentic connections really mattered, right? It pulled her into family and it pulled her into community. And I find, I've done hundreds of workshops on this stuff now. Everybody can do that, right? It's not asking you to go sail the ocean, right? It's asking you to say, how do you just take pivots on how you're running this project at work, right? Or how you're managing your exercise routine or whatever it is, just slight pivots that start to pull you into one of those groups. And it has a material impact. So to me, I think that's, if I had one thing I would say, whether you're doing all that together or not, it's do things like that get you into at least two and usually three groups. It just creates perspective. It takes less pressure, off the spousal relationship in different ways too.
So Rob, imagine that I'm a leader that you're advising on this show right now, and I've got an issue here. This is all resonating amazingly with me, but it's also feeling overwhelming because there are so many things that we're talking about right now, and I can see how a lot of the things you've said resonate with the reality of my existing life. You've got a number of resources here. You've got the app, which is brilliant. You've also got a microstress diagnostic that you can download, and we'll put links in the show note guide for both of these things. What can I do with those things right now to help me kind of raise my awareness and then get into some form of action around it? What would you advise me to do?
I would first start with the diagnostic, right? And that's a very simple table that you're going through and you're answering those three questions, right? That I'd mentioned before. It shows the microstresses down the side, the common sources of these microstresses, boss, loved ones, teammates, colleagues across the top. And give it 5 minutes, right? That's all, literally 5 minutes. And just say, where are, some of these stresses systemic enough in my life that I should be doing something about it, right? In the first pass through it, and put an X in those cells. Not all of them. Some people I see, they will have 10 X's before I can finish my statement. Just pick 3, right? Because if it's everything, it's nothing. Again, you're right back to that. It's a sea of stuff. Just get stuff you can get traction on. And say, where are 3, 4, 5 of these impacting me, systemic enough I should do something about it? Where are 3 or 4 of these that I'm unnecessarily causing, that's coming back at me in ways I hadn't thought about? And where are 2 or 3 of these that I should rise above, right? That gives you immediate traction on things. Then what I would suggest is don't pick the biggest microstress first to deal with. Pick the easiest one and go out to the app and then pull that card down and look at the video and look at the tool and do something about it, right? And then put yourself on maybe a timeline of not just trying to solve this all at once, but say, let's take, one this week and then another one the next week. And then maybe by week 3 or 4, pick the hairier ones, because you've gotten more confident in dealing with it. And I find that everybody has those ops. I mean, everybody does. What we're struggling with is it does feel like that C, right? And you can use the tools to kind of get down to small things, but that have a big impact because of that 3 to 5 times ratio. You remove those, you alter them. It has a significant impact on us.
Once I've done it for me, how would you suggest I might do that with my team?
I would definitely be doing there's a couple ways, really. One would be thinking about it in terms of one-on-ones, and just making it a fabric of how people are managing one-on-ones. What I'm hoping to see more of, and we're building tools and resources for this now as we've run some of these experiments, is this kind of, either 6 or 12-week journey that teams commit to, where they, Monday morning, they pick a microstress. You as a team leader, you pair 2 people in the team, get those people to be kind of accountable with each other. They write each other. Friday, they write what worked. Midpoint, you all talk about it, 3 weeks in or 6 weeks in. There's a pretty specific process that we're learning a lot about. And that's what I would love to see people doing more of. Because this is everybody always wants, whenever I do these books, like the last one, this one, whatever, they're always like, what's the one thing? If I just did this one thing, and you probably are thinking already, I'm going to end this podcast going, what's the one bit of advice that you have for people? And if I did, it would be intentional, right? You know what I mean? Be intentional on it. But the reality is it's a sea of this stuff, and you get down to things that you can do and take action on, and it starts to build a momentum. It starts to become a habit. Nothing in life is a one-time fix, right? This is more about how do you create a habit of seeing where this is happening and then shaping it, leaning into connections that are more meaningful, I believe, over time.
Promise you we won't ask you the one thing question. No.
We'll do it, yeah.
It's too nuanced. It's too nuanced for that, yeah, definitely.
Right.
Rob, can you tell us about the consortium you're part of, Connected Commons? I really enjoyed the piece of research you and your team did on physical well-being not being a solo sport. Can you talk to us about the power of networks at work and what's the consortium unearthed?
Yeah, so it's a group that I work, Connected Commons. It's a part of this broader group that I'm a part of called Institute for Corporate Productivity, and it is a way, basically, what our mission is in this work. I4CP is historically the leading community out there of HR practitioners looking at human capital as a way of solving leadership problems, change problems, culture problems, things like that. And what I'm introducing into that is this relational lens, right? And the ability to see how connections have impact, right, on different forms of things, whether it's around individual effectiveness, well-being, team performance, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, talent optimization, onboarding. There's a lot of different ways that we're kind of doing that. But at the heart of it, it's focused. We're focused very heavily on once you make these connections that matter transparent and you're specific, and here's the nature of the interactions, it gives leaders a chance to be able to take action that cultivates those connections, in a very different way. And so that's at the heart of it, what we're doing. And we've been at it for 26 years now, actually, doing different kind of pieces of understanding what matters with that network lens.
And you put a great emphasis on prioritizing physical wellness in network groups. I'd love to hear about your personal go-to rituals, practices, movements, what's keeping you well and who are you doing it with?
So for me, it became very clear that and it happened with the very first interview I was doing in this. So it actually had a pretty profound impact with me. I was talking with a life science executive in London, and I said, just tell me about a time you were becoming more physically healthy. And she just kind of laughed for a second and said, well, I was the person that dodged gym in high school with every chance, I could. And she said that worked for me up until my late 30s, early 40s. And my doctor gave me a stern warning and said, if you don't do something about it, you're going to be in trouble. And so her solution was she started walking around a park outside of London, her flat in London. And then she bumped into people that were walking at the same time, and they did a charity walk and a charity run. And you flash forward 10 years to when I was talking to her, and she was doing vacations with this group and her significant other, where they would run marathons first and then, go on the vacation. So it was a fantastic story, right, of transformation physically in this person's life. And she was saying the identity of being a runner was really critical to me in managing work-life balance, right? Suddenly that mattered more than the last 5 emails, right? That really could wait till tomorrow. But if you don't have something pulling you, you tend to just keep, focused on work in different ways. But she said the real key to it, and this is what stuck with me, was that she was suddenly spending time with a diverse array of people that created dimensionality in her life. So she wasn't hanging out with just life science executives. There was a male person, an auto mechanic, a cardiologist, software executive in this group. And she saw them at their worst. They saw her at her worst. There were deep friendships that were formed, but it created perspective on what true challenges were in her life, right? It wasn't just seen through her narrow lens in different ways. And so that, for me, in terms of my rituals, that's pervaded in a big way. I'm very focused for me on tennis. I have 3 different groups I play into. One group that's older, one group that's my age, one group that's younger that I call the kids. And unfortunately, the kids are mid-40s, which bums me out. But I'm very intentional about that. I'm super intentional about a cycling group that I ride with. You know what I mean? And again, because the trick for me was I wanted there to be the activity, but I'm actually quite an introvert. It's easy for me to pull away and go biking by myself. And I wanted that activity put into a set of relationships that kind of created that dimensionality, created the friendships, created the pull that keeps us going. So it's not like Weight Watchers has historically been about creating social pressure to show up and get on the scale, right? It's about how do you put that activity in a diverse group that then become friends, right? And doing things that cultivate that. That was what I saw created the long-term pull, the things that kind of kept people healthier over time.
So what's next for you, Rob?
Next book is around teams and looking at teams very differently today. We're conventionally still using ideas from Katzenbach and Smith, that we're very heavily around vision, mission, purpose, and alignment and getting everybody on the same page. And what we're seeing is that's very difficult in most contemporary organizations today. The teams have grown too large. The people are on too many of them, typically 5, 6 collaborative efforts. People are coming in and out of teams too quickly, right, for some of those ideas. So we've been able to use our analytics to see kind of internally how the more successful groups are collaborating, quality of the connections they're forming, and externally. And so we're, really focused on what's driving team performance and success, as well as when the teams falter, what kinds of patterns are they drifting into that people need to avoid. So that's next on the horizon.
Well, get that done quickly, please, because I want to read it. How can people get in touch with you? I'm sure we have listeners going, man, I want to workshop on this. Yeah. I want to do this.
Oh, yeah. I would love doing that right now. It's super meaningful. So it's rcross@babson.edu is an email. And then my website, obviously, is robcross.org, is a great place to go out. There's a ton of resources that we put out there in different ways for people to dig into.
Excellent. Well, we'll put those in the show notes.
So, Rob, thank you so much. As always, it's an absolute joy to talk to you. Your research is tackling the issues that our audience really care about, the really big challenges, the realities facing leaders today and their teams. So we really appreciate you, your work, and the generosity that you give away so much in all of that work. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for talking with me. I appreciate it.
Folks, order your copy of Microstress today. And until next time, remember, the world is evolving. Are you good?